My Uncle Marcus stood up in the middle of the lawyer's office and pointed his finger directly at my face. "You did this," he said. His voice was low, controlled, which somehow made it worse than if he'd screamed. "You went through his things. You had no right." I didn't move. I didn't even blink. I just held the folder against my chest, the one I'd found 3 weeks before in a shoebox behind Grandpa's water heater, and I looked him dead in the eyes. His wife Diane was already crying, not the sad kind of crying, the caught kind. The kind where your body just starts leaking because it knows what your mouth refuses to say. And my Aunt Rochelle, the one who had been smiling since the moment Grandpa's body went cold, the one who had already started redecorating his house in her head. She sat completely still, face like stone, and hands folded in her lap, waiting to see which way this was going to fall. The lawyer cleared his throat. Nobody looked at him. But to understand why we ended up in that room with that folder and those faces, I need to take you back to where this whole thing started. Back to the week Grandpa died, and the moment I realized that grief in my family had an expiration date of about 48 hours. If you enjoy stories like this, take a second to like the video, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I read every single one. And please share this with someone who loves real-life family drama. Because trust me, this one goes deep. My grandfather's name was Edmund. Everyone called him Ed. He was 79 years old. He smelled like cedar and motor oil. And he was the only person in my entire family who told the truth without apologizing for it. He died on a Tuesday, quietly, in his sleep, which is exactly the way he wanted to go, he'd told me once. "I don't want anybody making a fuss over me," he said. "Just let me slip out the back." I got the call from my mom at 6 in the morning. I sat on the edge of my bed for a long time before I could stand up. That's the thing nobody tells you about losing someone like that. Someone who was the foundation of everything. You don't just feel sad. You feel the ground shift under your feet. You suddenly don't know where anything is anymore. I drove to his house that morning. My mom was already there. My Uncle Marcus arrived about an hour later, and I remember this clearly, because it bothered me even then. Aunt Rochelle showed up with her hair done, full makeup, a silk blouse, like she was going somewhere nice. She hugged my mom. She hugged me. She walked through Grandpa's living room slowly, touching things. The lamp, the side table, the little ceramic dog he kept by the front door. Her fingers were moving like she was taking inventory. I told myself I was being uncharitable. People grieve differently, right? That's what you're supposed to say. But I watched her, and something in my stomach quietly disagreed. The next few days were the usual fog of arrangements and phone calls and food that neighbors keep bringing even though nobody's eating. Grandpa had pre-planned most of his funeral, which was so deeply him that it made me laugh and cry at the same time. He'd even picked the music, and he didn't want people wailing over him. He wanted a clean goodbye. It was at the reception after the burial that I first heard Rochelle use the phrase. She was standing near the kitchen with 2 of her friends, women I barely knew. And I caught it as I walked past with a plate of food I wasn't going to eat. Well, he always said I was his favorite. Everyone knew that. I stopped walking. I didn't turn around. I just stood there for a second, holding that plate, listening to her laugh softly at something one of her friends said back. His favorite. Now look, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that I was Grandpa's favorite. That's not the point. The point is that Grandpa Ed was not a man who had favorites. He loved all of us, but he loved us like a fair judge, with equal weight and zero tolerance for nonsense. And the idea that he had quietly decided Rochelle was special above everyone else and had apparently been telling her friends about it, that didn't sound like him, not even a little. But I let it go. Because it was the day we buried him, and I was tired, and sometimes people say things at funerals that don't mean anything. That was the first red flag, and I absolutely ignored it. The will reading was scheduled for 2 weeks later. Grandpa had a lawyer, a quiet, careful man named Mr. Adesanya, who had handled his affairs for over a decade. He called each family member personally to let us know the date and time. The night before, I couldn't sleep. I keep asking myself now why that was. Maybe some part of me already knew something was off. Or maybe it was just grief still doing its slow work on me. Either way, and I was awake at 2 in the morning and I made a decision that I didn't fully understand until much later. I drove to Grandpa's house. I had a key. I'd always had a key. He gave it to me years ago when I used to help him with his garden on weekends. I let myself in and I just sat there for a while, in his chair, in the dark, smelling the cedar and the old books and that particular quiet that a house gets when the person it belonged to is gone. And then, because I didn't know what else to do with myself, I started tidying up a little. Moving things into boxes the way you do when grief needs somewhere to go. I was working in the back hallway when I noticed it. The access panel near the water heater, a little square of drywall that was supposed to sit flush against the wall, was slightly open. Just a crack. Just enough to notice if you were standing at the right angle in the right light. I told myself it was nothing. I opened it anyway. Inside, behind the copper piping, wrapped in an old dishcloth, was a shoebox. And inside the shoebox were documents. I sat on the hallway floor for a long time before I even touched them. I don't know why. Something about the way they were hidden. Not locked away, not in a safe, but tucked behind a water heater like a secret someone needed to keep close, made me feel like I was about to step off a ledge. I pulled the first paper out. It was a bank statement, Grandpa's account, and on it, highlighted, I don't know when, I don't know by whom, were a series of withdrawals. Regular, consistent, going back almost 4 years. The amounts weren't enormous, 200 here, 500 there, and sometimes 800. But they were steady, every few weeks like clockwork. And next to each one in Grandpa's handwriting were 2 letters. R.M. Rochelle Marcus, her married name. I sat there on that hallway floor in the dark in my grandfather's house the night before his will was going to be read, and I looked at 4 years of withdrawals marked with my aunt's initials. And I thought, okay, maybe he was giving her money, maybe she needed help. That happens in families. That's not automatically a crime. But then I pulled out the next paper, and that one had a signature on it, Grandpa's signature. Except I'd seen Grandpa's signature my entire life, on birthday cards, on the back of photographs, on the little notes he used to tuck into my lunch when I stayed with him as a kid. And the signature on that paper was not his. And I put everything back in the shoebox. I took the shoebox, I locked the house behind me and sat in my car for 20 minutes before I could drive. The next morning I walked into that lawyer's office with the folder I'd made, copies of every document organized by date, held against my chest like a shield. Rochelle was already there when I arrived. She had her silk blouse on again. She was chatting and warm and gracious, moving around the room like she was hosting a party she'd already won. She smiled at me when I walked in. I smiled back, and I thought, she has no idea what's in this folder. Mr. Adesanya opened the will at exactly 10 o'clock. He read the opening lines, the standard language, the sound of a life being formally transferred to what comes after it. And then he paused. He looked up over his glasses at the room. There is, he said carefully, a condition. Rochelle uncrossed her legs and leaned forward slightly. I watched her face. And that's when everything started to move. Mr. Adesanya didn't rush it. That's the thing I remember most about that moment. The way he let the silence sit there in the room like a third presence. He set the document down on the desk in front of him, folded his hands on top of it, and looked around at each of us before he said another word. Rochelle's husband, Marcus, shifted in his chair. My mom reached over and touched my arm without looking at me. Two of Grandpa's old neighbors who had been named in a small bequest sat near the back wall, completely still, like they could feel something was coming even if they didn't know what. And Rochelle, I need you to understand this. Rochelle was still smiling. Just slightly. Just enough. Like a woman who had already counted the money and was simply waiting for someone else to finish the formality of handing it over. Before the estate is distributed, Mr. Adesanya said, Mr. Edmund left specific instructions. He calls it, in his own words here, and he looked down at the page, a verification period. Marcus frowned. What does that mean? It means, the lawyer said without looking up yet, that before any beneficiary receives their portion of the estate, Mr. Edmund required that a full financial audit be conducted of all transactions, transfers, and agreements made in his name during the last 5 years of his life. The room went very quiet. Not the polite kind of quiet, the held breath kind. I looked at Rochelle. The smile was still there, but something behind her eyes had moved, just slightly. Like a curtain shifting in a window when you can't feel any wind. Now I need to pause here and be honest with you, because this is the part where I have to tell you something about my grandfather that I think explains everything that came after. Grandpa Ed was not a naive man. He was not some sweet, disconnected old man who got confused by paperwork. He had run a small construction business for 30 years. He had built things with his hands and managed contracts and dealt with suppliers who tried to cheat him more times than he could count. He understood money. He understood people. But he was also 80 years old and lived alone after my grandmother passed. And I really believe this, that being alone changed him in ways none of us noticed until it was too late. Not because he got weak, but because he got tired, and of fighting, of questioning, of being the one who always had to see through people. He told me something once about 2 years before he died. We were in his garden, he was pulling weeds, and I was doing the thing where you try to help but mostly just watch. He said, "You know what wears a person down more than hard work? Loving someone who takes." I thought he was talking about my grandmother's illness, about the years of caretaking. I didn't understand then that he was talking about something else entirely. That was the second red flag, and I missed it completely. Mr. Adesanya continued reading. The estate was substantial, not extravagant, but the kind of wealth a careful man builds slowly over a lifetime. The house, investments, a savings account that most people in that room didn't know existed, and Grandpa had distributed it thoughtfully. Portions for my mom, for Marcus, for 3 grandchildren, including me, and a final allocation listed simply as pending audit resolution. That last phrase sat in the air like smoke. Marcus cleared his throat. Pending audit? What exactly is being audited? Are you suggesting someone in this family? I'm not suggesting anything, Mr. Adesanya said calmly. Mr. Edmund's instructions are clear. The audit happens before distribution. That was his condition. It was added to the will 14 months ago, and it was witnessed and notarized. 14 months ago, I did the math quickly. 14 months ago was around the time Grandpa stopped answering his phone as regularly as he used to. Around the time he started sounding tired on our calls in a way I told myself was just age. He had known. He had known for at least 14 months that something was wrong. And instead of confronting it, instead of starting a war in his family while he was still alive and tired and didn't have the energy to fight, he'd packaged it up neatly and handed it to the law. That was so completely him that I had to press my lips together to keep myself from making a sound. "This is ridiculous," Rochelle said. Her voice was controlled, smooth, but something underneath it had an edge now, like a knife wrapped in cloth. Dad was not... He wasn't suspicious of his own family. This doesn't sound like him at all. I want to see that document. I want to see the exact language. Mr. Adesanya turned the pages toward her without a word. She leaned forward and read it. And as she read, I watched her face do something fascinating. And it cycled through about 4 different expressions in the space of 10 seconds. Confidence, then confusion, then something that might have been calculation, and then finally, very carefully, a kind of practiced blankness. She sat back. "Fine," she said. "An audit is fine. We have nothing to hide." Marcus said nothing. He was looking at the table. I noticed that. I filed it away. The meeting ended without the drama I think some part of me had expected. Mr. Adesanya explained the process. An independent accountant would be brought in. All relevant financial records would be requested, and the distribution would be paused until the review was complete. It was all very procedural, very calm. People gathered their things. My mom was quiet beside me, doing what she always does when she's overwhelmed, yet which is focus intensely on something small and irrelevant, in this case straightening the strap on her handbag. I stayed in my seat. As the room thinned out, I caught Rochelle near the door. She was murmuring something to Marcus, her hand on his arm, her back to the lawyer. And then Marcus turned and looked at me over her shoulder. That look. I've thought about that look 100 times since then. There was anger in it. That was the surface. But underneath the anger was something that looked a lot like fear. The kind of fear that knows it has a reason to exist. He looked away first. I waited until only Mr. Adesanya and I were left in the room. Then I put the folder on the desk. "I found some documents," I said, "at his house. Before tonight, I didn't know if they meant anything, but given what you just read..." I stopped and took a breath. "I think they might be relevant to the audit." Mr. Adesanya looked at the folder, then at me. He had one of those faces that gives almost nothing away, but his eyes, just for a second, told me that he was not entirely surprised. "Your grandfather spoke very highly of you," he said. I didn't know what to do with that, so I just nodded. He opened the folder. He turned through the pages slowly. The bank statements, the withdrawal records, and then the page I'd been most uncertain about, the one with the signature that wasn't Grandpa's. He stopped on that one. He looked at it for a long time. "Where did you find this specific document?" he asked. His voice had shifted. Still calm, but focused now in a different way. I told him about the shoebox, the water heater, the access panel left just slightly open. He nodded, like something had just confirmed itself. "This document," he said carefully, "is a power of attorney. If genuine, it would have given the holder nearly full authority over your grandfather's financial decisions." I felt the air go out of the room. "But you said if genuine." "Yes." He closed the folder. "Because your grandfather told me approximately 16 months ago that he had never signed one." I sat in my car for a long time again that night, becoming a kind of habit. A forged power of attorney. 4 years of withdrawals. Initials in the margins in my grandfather's own handwriting. Because he knew and he was keeping track, and he was building a record even as it was happening to him. Not because he was helpless, because he was patient, because he wanted it done right. And underneath all of that, the thought I couldn't shake. Rochelle hadn't acted alone. The withdrawals were consistent and regular over 4 years. That's not someone grabbing opportunistically. That's a system, a routine. That takes coordination. That takes someone on the inside helping to keep it quiet. Marcus had looked at the table when she said we have nothing to hide. Not at her, not at the lawyer. At the table. I thought about that. I thought about the initials. I thought about how a forged signature on a legal document doesn't just happen. Someone has to file it somewhere. Someone has to present it to a bank. Someone has to stand across the counter and hand it over without flinching. Marcus had worked in property management for 20 years. He knew how documents moved. He knew what offices asked questions and which ones didn't. I started to understand the shape of it. But shapes aren't proof. And what I had in that folder was close. It was very close. But there were still pieces missing. There was still a gap between what I could see and what I could prove. I needed to follow the paper trail further. Grandpa had left me the first part of it, hidden behind a water heater because he trusted me to find it, or maybe just because he ran out of time to hand it to me himself. But somewhere I had a feeling there was more. There was a reason he hadn't put everything in one place. A reason the shoebox was the beginning and not the whole story. I just didn't know where the next piece was yet. I found the second hiding place by accident. That's the part that still gets me even now, after everything, after all of it. The thing that broke the whole case open wasn't some brilliant move I made. And it was a Sunday afternoon, 3 days after the will reading, when I went back to Grandpa's house to finish sorting through his things. And I knocked a coffee mug off the kitchen shelf. It fell behind the radiator. And when I crouched down to fish it out, I saw the envelope. It was taped to the back of the radiator with 2 strips of old masking tape, flush against the wall. Completely invisible unless you were lying on your stomach on the kitchen floor at exactly that angle. It had my name on the front, not my full name, just what he always called me. Bug. He'd called me that since I was 4 years old. I have no idea why. I never asked. And seeing it written there in his handwriting, in that quiet kitchen that still smelled like him, was the closest I came to falling apart through this entire thing. I sat on the kitchen floor for a while before I opened it. Inside was a letter, 4 pages front and back, written in Grandpa's careful print, the kind of handwriting that belonged to a man who had learned to write when people still took it seriously. And a smaller sealed envelope tucked behind it labeled, "For Mr. Adesanya. In the event I am no longer here." I read the letter first. I'm not going to read you every word of it. Some of it was private. Things he said to me about my grandmother, about the years before I was born, about regrets that belonged only to him. But the part that mattered, the part that changed everything, started on page 2. He wrote, "I want you to know I am not a foolish man. I saw what was happening. I let it go on longer than I should have, and I want to explain why. Not to excuse it, but because I think you deserve to understand." He had known about the withdrawals for almost 3 years before he died. He had noticed the pattern himself, going back through his statements one evening when he was bored and couldn't sleep. Small amounts, regular, always just below the threshold that would trigger an automatic bank alert. Someone had known exactly where that threshold was. He wrote that he confronted Rochelle once, just once, about 18 months before he died. He didn't tell her what he'd found. He just asked her carefully whether she'd been having any financial trouble, whether there was anything she needed to tell him. She cried. She told him she'd been struggling, that Marcus's business had hit a rough patch, that she was embarrassed and hadn't wanted to ask. She promised she would pay everything back. She held his hands and called him Daddy the way she had when she was small. And he, his words, chose to believe her because it was easier than the alternative. He wrote, "That was the last time I was soft about it." After that conversation, he started keeping records. Every withdrawal, every irregular transaction, every document that came across his desk that he didn't remember requesting. He noted dates, amounts, and anything that felt wrong. He took photographs of documents with the disposable camera he kept in his nightstand, the kind he used for grandchildren's birthdays, and he filed those photographs in the shoebox. But the shoebox, he wrote, was only half of it. The second envelope was the other half. I called Mr. Adesanya that same evening. He came to the house the next morning. Ed and I handed him both the letter and the sealed envelope with his name on it. He read the letter while I made coffee neither of us drank. When he finished, he opened the second envelope. Inside were copies of documents I hadn't seen before, things Grandpa had obtained himself somehow through channels I still don't fully understand. Bank records that showed not just withdrawals but where the money had gone, transfer receipts. And one document that made Mr. Adesanya set down his coffee cup and pick up his phone. It was a property deed, a small rental property on the east side of the city purchased 3 years ago, titled in Rochelle and Marcus's names. Purchased according to the attached payment record with a wire transfer from an account in Grandpa's name. An account that, when I looked at the number, I didn't recognize, not the main account, not the savings account. A third account, one that had apparently been opened using the forged power of attorney that none of us had known existed. They hadn't just been taking from him. They had opened an account in his name and used it to buy themselves an investment property. I sat with that for a long time. The audacity of it, the patience of it. The way it had been constructed so carefully over years, each piece small enough to explain away on its own, but together it was a machine. It had been running quietly in the background of our family for years while Grandpa sat in his chair and kept his records and waited for the right moment to hand it to someone who would finish what he'd started. He chose me, and I still don't know entirely why. Maybe because I used to sit with him in the garden. It's maybe because I knocked on his door more than the others. Maybe just because I was the one who showed up that Tuesday morning before the sun was fully up and sat in his chair in the dark. Because I didn't know where else to be. Whatever the reason, he chose me, and I was not going to let him down. The audit took 6 weeks. 6 weeks of the independent accountant going through every record, every statement, every filing. 6 weeks of Rochelle calling my mother and leaving messages that my mother stopped returning after the second week. 6 weeks of Marcus going completely silent. No calls, no appearances, nothing. Just absence, which told its own story. Rochelle tried once to contact me directly. She called on a Wednesday evening. I let it go to voicemail. She left a message that was 3 minutes and 40 seconds long. I know because I listened to it twice and timed it the second time, in which she moved through 5 distinct emotional registers. She started warm and reasonable. Then she got nostalgic, bringing up family memories, things we had done together when I was young. Then came the pivot to hurt feelings, the suggestion that I was tearing the family apart over a misunderstanding. Then a brief but pointed suggestion that Grandpa had not been mentally well toward the end, that his judgment couldn't be fully trusted, that the documents might not mean what I thought they meant. And then, at the very end, quiet and flat and stripped of all the performance. You don't know what our situation was. You don't know what we were dealing with. He would have wanted to help us. I sat with that last line for a long time. Because here's the thing, and this is the part that hurts most to say out loud. She wasn't entirely wrong that he would have wanted to help them. Grandpa was generous. If Marcus's business had really been struggling, if they had come to him honestly and asked, he would have helped. I know that in my bones. But they hadn't asked. They had taken. And then taken again. And then built a structure around the taking so that it would keep working even after they thought he was too old to notice. That's not hardship. That's a choice. The meeting where the audit results were presented was not the dramatic confrontation you might be imagining. There was no screaming, No door being kicked open, no single explosive moment where everyone broke down and confessed. And it was actually very quiet. Mr. Adesanya presented the findings in that same careful, measured way he did everything. The accountant walked through the numbers, the forged power of attorney, the unauthorized account, the property purchase, the total amount taken over 4 years, which came to just under $60,000. Rochelle sat through most of it with her arms crossed and her jaw set, looking at the wall somewhere to the left of the lawyer's head. Marcus looked at the table again. Same table, same posture, like he'd been practicing. When it was over, Rochelle said, "We'll need to speak with our own attorney." Mr. Adesanya said that was absolutely their right. And then my mom, quiet, careful, handbag-straightening mom who I had never once in my life heard raise her voice at a family member, said very softly, "Rochelle, and he knew. He knew the whole time, and he still left you something in the will. He left all of us something. He didn't cut you out." She paused. "I need you to understand what kind of man that makes him, and what kind it makes you." Rochelle didn't answer. She picked up her bag and left. The property was eventually signed back over to the estate as part of the legal resolution. Most of the $60,000 was recovered over time through a structured repayment agreement. Going to court was an option, but a long and brutal one, and the family was already exhausted enough. Grandpa's estate was distributed. His house went to my mom, who has kept every piece of furniture exactly where it was. Marcus and Rochelle are still together, as far as I know. We don't speak. There's a version of this story where I'm supposed to say I forgave them, and where the lesson is about letting go and choosing peace and not letting bitterness be the thing you carry out of something like this. I'm working on it. I'm genuinely working on it. But what I carry more than anything, more than the anger, more than the grief that got tangled up in all of this, is the letter. The one addressed to Bug. The one he wrote in his careful handwriting on 4 pages front and back, taped behind a radiator in his kitchen, waiting for me to knock a coffee mug off a shelf. Near the end of it, after all the facts and the records and the careful documentation, he wrote one more thing. He wrote, "I am not telling you this to make you angry. I am telling you this because the truth deserves a witness. I spent too long being the only one who knew it. That's a lonely thing. And I didn't want to leave without passing it to someone, so I'm passing it to you. Do with it what feels right. I trust you." I folded that letter back up. I put it in the same shoebox, and I kept it. Because some things, even the hard ones, even the ones that cost you, are worth keeping. That was the Will Reading Trap. Thank you for listening all the way to the end. If this story moved you, share it with someone. Leave a comment and tell me what part hit you hardest. I read everyone.